Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie on Monday, November the 17th, 2025. Today there is a Grand Trine in water signs involving the Sun, Jupiter and Saturn. And in this video I want to go into some detail about what this Grand Trine might mean. I also want to go back to Jeffrey Epstein's chart, and the reason for this is I'd made an omission. I did look at Jeffrey Epstein's chart a couple of days ago, but I didn't refresh my birth details. In particular, I didn't have a time of birth. I thought there wasn't a time of birth available for Jeffrey Epstein, but as it happens, we do now have a time for him, according to Astro.com. He was born at 6:15 a.m. So I do want to have a quick look at Jeffrey Epstein's chart at the end of this video, now that I do have this exact time. But before I look in detail at the Grand Trine and at Jeffrey Epstein, I want to consider the astrology and the I Ching for today, which is Monday, November the 17th, 2025. So here is the chart for today. Don't forget to like and subscribe if appropriate. Top right, I have a triangle, blue triangle, to represent the fact that today there is a Grand Trine in water signs. So turning to the chart of today, the moon is in late Libra. So it is getting ready to change sign, and it is in the Via Combusta. So the week starts with the moon in late Libra. So the Via Combusta runs between 15 Libra and 15 Scorpio. And in my experience, the last half of Scorpio tends to be more difficult than the first half of Libra. And indeed, this evening London time at 21:44, what's that, 9:44 p.m., the moon moves into Scorpio. So that would be earlier if you're in the Americas. If you're in the Americas, then this afternoon the moon will move into Scorpio. So that does create a change. The day starts with the moon in an air sign, and when it leaves the air sign, well, that means that there aren't any traditional planets in air signs anymore. Sure, we got Pluto in Aquarius, but Pluto's not a traditional planet. And we do have, once that sign change has happened, we have 3 planets in Scorpio: the moon, Venus, and the sun. And there is a lot of water around. The sun is making a trine to Jupiter. The Sun is making a trine to Saturn. Jupiter and Saturn are pretty close to making a trine to each other. They are, less than a quarter of a degree apart. So that means we have a Grand Trine. So, we can break that Grand Trine up into its component parts. We've got Jupiter trine Saturn. We've got Sun trine Jupiter, Sun trine Saturn. So, the Sun is an important planet. I mean, some would say that it's not quite as important as the moon, but still, with the Sun trine Jupiter, you like the sound of that. We like the sound of that. That sounds quite fortunate. Things can come together. We can be happy, and we can see possibilities. We don't necessarily have to talk about these opportunities, but they're definitely there. And then we've got the Sun trine Saturn. Sun trine Saturn is supposedly about discipline. I say supposedly because I've got Sun trine Saturn in my horoscope, Sun in Gemini trine Saturn in Aquarius. I don't know about that Sun trine Saturn. I can be disciplined in some respects. I can do these videos every day, but aside from that, it can be hard work. But with Sun trine Saturn, maybe we'll be able to get ourselves together. And, we also have to think about what does it mean to have these 3 planets, Sun, Jupiter, and Saturn, all together in this triangular formation, the Grand Trine in water signs. And, normally when you think about Grand Trines in water signs, well, you think about a bit of chaos, things getting out of control, things running too smoothly. But Saturn is involved, and it's possible that Saturn creates a bit of discipline. And aside from a Grand Trine in water, well, I will be talking at greater length about the Grand Trine in water signs at the end of this video. Aside from that, we have, the moon makes a square to Jupiter. The moon in Libra making a square to Jupiter in Cancer. So moon square Jupiter could be potentially about taking something too far, but I don't think in a particularly dramatic way. We might exaggerate, and that maybe we'll spend too much money, we'll emote inappropriate use of emotions. Maybe that's one way of looking at it, but I don't regard moon square Jupiter as a particularly problematic aspect, and maybe the Sun trine Saturn will create some discipline and will make sure the moon square Jupiter doesn't get out of control. Additionally, we have Mercury making a sextile to Pluto. So Mercury at 1 degree 50 Sagittarius is retrograding back onto the sextile with Pluto. So Mercury sextile Pluto can be about using our brain in an effective way, understanding what we can do, what we can accomplish, and maybe tuning into our mental power. And we can maybe express this in terms of, how we talk to people, how we can be persuasive. Yeah, it can be persuasive. We can be persuasive. Other people can be persuasive as well. Are we going to be the ones being persuaded, or are we going to be the persuaders? Now, another aspect that's just coming in, it's exact tomorrow on Tuesday, is Mars sesquiquadrate Jupiter. So Mars and Jupiter are 135 degrees apart. And when you think about Mars and Jupiter, it's not necessarily a fortunate pairing. Mars Jupiter can take things too far, and this aspect, Mars in Sagittarius, 130, making this 135 degree aspect to Jupiter. Mars in Sagittarius sometimes doesn't know when to stop, doesn't know where its limits are, can exaggerate and feel that it's got just so much energy, it's got to do something with it. But it is sesquiquadrate Jupiter in Cancer. And so if we do use up too much energy too quickly in the wrong places, we might embarrass ourselves, or we just might go too far. So that is certainly possible with Mars sesquiquadrate Jupiter. Now, turning to the picture for Sydney, Australia. So here it is. Moon is at 19 Libra. So that tells us that if you are in Australia or New Zealand or East Asia, the moon is not going to go into Scorpio today. It will be in Libra, all day long. And as far as what the moon does in Libra, well, it doesn't do a great deal. The moon, sure, it makes a square to Jupiter, maybe right at. No, in fact, it does. It makes a square to Jupiter. That's what it's doing. And maybe the day, to an extent, could be defined by that moon square Jupiter. Over the course of the day, if you are in Australia or New Zealand, you may feel that things are ramping up, but you want to put more and more energy into something. And this is facilitated by the fact that we've got this Grand Trine in water signs, maybe the Sun making a trine to Jupiter. And the key thing here is to exercise some discipline, and I think you can exercise discipline because of Saturn. The Sun is making a trine to Jupiter, but it's also making a trine to Saturn. So all of that enthusiasm can be focused on something concrete. And then there is the heliocentric view, putting the Sun at the center of the solar system. And Venus is making an opposition to Chiron, still making an opposition to Chiron. I did talk about Venus opposition Chiron when I looked at the astrology for the weekend, and Venus opposition Chiron can be about us feeling somewhat separate, somewhat different. Venus is a planet of relationships. Chiron is a planet of maybe wanting to do things differently, wanting to think outside the box. And so somehow our approach may not necessarily be in accord with other people's approach. And that could cause a certain amount of disagreement, but we don't seem to mind. I mean, this could be how Venus opposition Chiron works. And, being different, has its own difficulties. It's never easy standing out as an individual, particularly if we're expressing unusual ideas, perhaps ideas about how people should relate, how people should get on with each other. And in some respects, it might be best to just keep quiet. But maybe with Venus opposition Chiron, we don't want to keep quiet because there is something important to be said. And don't forget, on a different note, heliocentrically, Saturn is moving ever closer to a conjunction of Neptune. Saturn is now 35, 40 arc minutes from that conjunction of Neptune. And we've already had a conjunction of Neptune, have we, geocentrically? I think we came very close to that conjunction of Neptune, but heliocentrically you don't get retrograde motion. So once you get that conjunction, that's it. And so as Saturn moves towards that conjunction of Neptune, it's telling us something about what's happening, how people are feeling, and a lot of people are worried. They don't really feel particularly comfortable, about the way things are working. Oh, and another thing, the Earth is making a semi-sextile to Chiron. So we've got Chiron opposition Venus, and we've got Earth semi-sextile Chiron. And semi-sextile can be about trying to integrate. I like to use the word integrate when describing semi-sextiles and quincunxes. It's something we're trying to integrate. We're trying to be different. We're not just there to follow the crowd. I mean, what is the point? I mean, if we just follow the crowd at every step of the way, we're just robots, and we're not robots. Hopefully we're not robots. And there is an opportunity here to be different, but being different, very often does have a cost. So now I want to move to the 12 signs. So these are my forecasts for the 12 signs for today, which is Monday, November the 17th, 2025. The moon is moving out of Libra and into Scorpio. And so with the moon moving out of Libra into Scorpio, certain things could become more complicated. You, for example, might see people in a particular way. You got used to their role in your life, even if you don't know them very well. And with the moon moving into Scorpio, things that were supposed to be relatively simple actually take more work, and they also require more processing. And that's always a thing, processing. It's the processing that takes time. It's not necessarily something that you can see people doing or you doing. You try to process things, you try to understand things. And you want something to be simple, but with the moon moving into Scorpio, things are just not quite as simple as they should be. And so you spend a lot of time, trying to work it all out. And that can indeed be hard work. And it requires patience. You shouldn't assume that you're just going to reach a particular conclusion quickly. And it may be a case of, taking your time. There may not be a hurry. And it's just It's just better that you start to understand, perhaps what's going on under the surface. And that's not necessarily something that Aries wants to do. I mean, Aries does like things to be straightforward, but at the moment, they're not particularly straightforward. It just doesn't feel that way. Although, you yourself, you do want to move forward. You want to move forward quickly, but it just isn't always easy. But it doesn't mean to say it's a real problem. It's just a time when you do have to make some effort to sort of work on an emotional level, or at least to understand other people's emotions and how complicated they might be. And in the process, Aries, you might want to make some distinctions. I mean, distinctions are important. You distinguish, for example, between, what is your domain and what is another person's domain. Where does your responsibility end? And, where does another person's responsibility start? You can't be responsible for everything. And I mean, there might be pressure to be responsible for everything, but frankly, that's not realistic. And in certain cases, it may be necessary to sort of distance yourself a bit from what's going on. And it might be the case, Aries, that you decide that enough is enough. Something that you've been involved in for some time, you see how it's going, you've perhaps benefited from it, you feel maybe you've done your bit, you've discharged your responsibility, and now it is time to move on. And finally, I mean, I should point out that there is a Grand Trine in water signs. And, this Grand Trine in water signs, as far as you're concerned, it really emphasizes what I was saying about your emotions. It's a very emotional Grand Trine. Yeah, because it's in water signs do relate to the emotions. But on a personal level, I think it is especially strong, and perhaps the action is taking place in quite a sort of a hidden way, but it is something that is nonetheless very real. And perhaps, Aries, you do need to consider which way your emotions are going, how your unconscious is treating you, what material is being manifested. Because it's very easy for things to just crop up, things to just appear, and you just don't know quite what to do with them. That can give you an image which you kind of got to integrate, and back to this concept of integration. And how do you show how different you are? And that's a theme, for all of us, for everyone. So, Aries, I'm not saying that it's going to be an entirely straightforward day, but I think if you're able to tune into your emotions and you're ready to look at things deeply, and you don't just focus on things from a surface perspective, I think that there could be a point where you reach really quite a fundamental level of understanding. Taurus. There is a Grand Trine in water signs, and this Grand Trine in water signs could well affect you. It really could. I mean, you've got the sun in your opposite sign, and the sun is trine Jupiter, trine Saturn, and this Grand Trine in water signs, from a Taurean perspective, may well say something about other people and what they're doing and how you relate to them. And it is probably, Taurus, worth your while putting some effort into your social life and into relationships, giving people a chance. And perhaps you can start something off, making a suggestion, making an introduction, and once one thing starts another thing comes into play. Now, that's the way Grand Trines work. There isn't much in the way of resistance. And so, things could happen quickly. So if you make an effort to be with people, to try to make things happen, to make suggestions, you're likely to get a response. I mean, this response may not be entirely what you were expecting. I mean, after all, the moon is in the Via Combustor. The Via Combustor, remember, it's that part of the sky between 15 Libra and 15 Scorpio. The moon starts the day in late Libra, ends the day in late Scorpio. Okay, that kind of depends on your time zone. If you're in Australia or New Zealand, it won't go into Scorpio until tomorrow, Tuesday. But, with the moon in the Via Combustor, things can happen. People can behave in a way that you hadn't necessarily expected or anticipated. And, as a Taurus, you kind of like things to develop in a way that is fairly predictable, and you don't always like surprises, but perhaps you should be prepared for a surprise. And just because something happens you weren't expecting, doesn't mean it's the end of the world. It doesn't mean that you have to drop everything. It doesn't mean that everything has been turned upside down, but everything is a disaster. No, instead you just have to take on board what is happening and perhaps, adjust your strategy, ever so slightly, and that should be fine. And it shouldn't be a problem because there is this Grand Trine in water signs, and this Grand Trine in water signs does allow you to just sort of go with the flow, move from one thing to another thing, and not feel that you're in any way constrained. And in actual fact, Taurus, if you are able to go with the flow, if you don't feel that you need to be limited by anything and that you're ready for pretty much anything, then in your own way you can exercise some power. And perhaps your power is all about being unflappable, not panicking, just staying with it, regarding change as just a natural process. And you keep your cool. Maybe other people are concerned, they're worried, they don't know what's happening, but you know what's going on. If you just listen to your feelings, and if you're in a position where other people are uncertain of themselves, well, that does give you a certain power, doesn't it? And it might even give you some responsibility. There is something you are supposed to be doing. Something you're supposed to be presenting. And if you're sure of yourself, then that's a real bonus. Other people may take the view, well, if you're sure of yourself, well, maybe you're someone to follow. Which goes back to this question of responsibility. You might just find yourself in a responsible position when you really weren't expecting it, because it just seemed to begin with. But it was just other people were holding all the cards. Other people were taking the initiative. You had to just follow someone else's lead. But in actual fact, it might be the opposite, especially when things don't go to plan. And just the key point is, don't panic. Even if you feel like panicking, if you can just keep your cool, I think that that could actually put you in a very strong position. Gemini. Mercury is making a sextile to Pluto. And, this sextile to Pluto, I would regard it as being a pretty fortunate aspect. It means that you can have an influence. And I think Geminis like to have an influence. It may be, very mild, but everything you say, everything you do, will have an impact. And, that should be reassuring because, you do matter. You do have a role to play. And in spite of your own doubts, there is a purpose. Geminis can sometimes have issues with a purpose, but by having a role to play, by seeing the influence you can have, then I think that can make you feel a whole lot better. Now the question is, how do you actually have an influence? Well, having an influence is not just about throwing your weight around, telling people what to do. It's about understanding other people, making a special effort to understand them, and being ready to listen again and again and again, perhaps to go back over old ground. Mercury's going retrograde. Nothing wrong with going back over old ground, because you want to be certain of yourself. And perhaps, you are preparing for a change, but, everyone is preparing for a change. And because you understand what other people are going through, well, that does give you a certain amount of influence. And certainly, Gemini, if you want to have an impact, you certainly can. I mean, look at Mercury. Look at Mercury's position. If you look at what's going on, we kind of have a very wide conjunction involving the Sun and Mars. Now, normally you wouldn't. It's Sun and Mars. I mean, Sun and Mars are 14 degrees apart, and they're in different signs. So you might be thinking, well, where is the conjunction there? But the thing is that Mercury is halfway between the Sun and Mars. It's 8 degrees from Mars. It's 6 degrees from the Sun. So you could say that Mercury is conjunct the Sun-Mars midpoint. And so with Mercury conjunct the Sun-Mars midpoint, that does give you a reasonable amount of power. And you are in a position where you really can make things happen. And in fact, some Geminis, might be quite impatient, too impatient. And your mind is moving quickly, even though Mercury is retrograde. You want something to happen, it's not happening, and you expect someone else to deliver. And if you're too pushy, well, you might not get the right reaction. So, yeah, give people a chance. I know you want things to be done right now, but you have to be patient. You have to understand, and you have to be sensitive enough to be aware of other people's limitations, as well as other people's state of mind. They don't want someone talking too much, being pushy, saying that you want something, saying you want it right now. That's not going to go down well. So, Gemini, it's true that you've got a lot of power. It's also true that you can probably get your way. If you want something done, it can be done. You just have to ask. Maybe you'll have to ask twice. Maybe you'll have to shout, but you can get it done. But the question is, what is the cost? And the cost of getting something done now this minute rather than tomorrow could be substantial in terms of spending your social capital. You've got social capital in terms of, everyone around you. And you want that social capital to build. But you don't want to spend it all at once. And you could spend it all at once for very little, because you're impatient, because you want instant results. You'll get your instant results. But, the question is, at what cost? And the cost could be quite enormous. And additionally, you may not be the only one who is impatient. Mars is starting to make a sesquiquadrate to Jupiter. And this Mars sesquiquadrate Jupiter might indicate that there is someone out there who is looking for results. They want things done, and they may want things done even quicker than you want things done. And the question is, who is that person, and how do you respond to them? You want other people to respond quickly to you, but are you able to respond as quickly to them? Well, maybe you're not, and it could be that your impatience is almost mirrored by someone else's impatience, and that just might be the nature of the day. And so Gemini, don't be in too much of a hurry. Nothing absolutely has to be done, right now. And don't forget that the moon is moving through late Scorpio. So if you're in the Americas, that effectively means that the moon is void. It's made its last aspect before leaving the sign. Okay, if you're in Australasia, it's not void necessarily because the moon is applying to a square of Jupiter. But once the moon has made that square to Jupiter, it just feels that nothing is actually happening. So you might want things to happen, but with a void moon, why would you expect anything to happen? You need to wait for the moon to move into Scorpio. Now, moon is moving into Scorpio. Well, in Australasia, that's not going to happen today. But if you're in Europe, then late this evening moves into Scorpio. But if you're in the Americas, in the afternoon, once the moon moves into Scorpio, perhaps it's reasonable to think that something could happen. But even then, it might be necessary to wait until tomorrow. So I do appreciate that Mercury is on the Sun-Mars midpoint, and if you want something to happen, then Gemini, I would suggest that you perhaps make it happen on your own, rather than getting other people irritated, because there's only so much you can expect from other people. And if you're doing things on your own as much as is possible, that might be the best approach. And in the end, it's all about you working out what needs to be done and then just getting on with it and not necessarily asking anyone for any help. Cancer. The moon is changing sign. The moon is moving into Scorpio. So with the moon moving into Scorpio, we do get an increased level of emotion, which isn't a problem for you, Cancer, because you are a water sign. So the moon moving into a water sign, into Scorpio, is something you can deal with. And that when you're dealing with things on an emotional level, things don't necessarily go to plan. That doesn't mean to say they get completely destroyed or totally disrupted. It's not quite like that. But you know that you can't expect everything to follow a particular path, and if you can be open to changes, that would be better. Remember, the moon is in the Vir Combustor, and when the moon is in the Vir Combustor, things can just happen, and that things can just happen. So it shouldn't really bother you. And at the same time, we have got a Grand Trine in water signs. And so, this Grand Trine in water signs involves Jupiter, Saturn, and the Sun. So to be more precise, we have got Jupiter in Cancer, Jupiter in your sign. We've got the Sun in Scorpio, and we've got Saturn in Pisces. And, this Grand Trine involving Sun, Jupiter, and Saturn is a relatively rare event. It really doesn't happen, that often. And so when it does happen, you should try to take advantage of it, particularly as you're a Cancerian. And, you've got all this stuff in water, and, you have a chance to take something that might be vague and could even be somewhat over-emotional. Perhaps it's something you're passionate about. And you have an opportunity to make it real, to become part of your personal constellation. We all have our constellations. We all have the environment in which we work, a subjective environment, how we see things. So you take all this energy and rather than just being overwhelmed by it, because you're not going to be overwhelmed by it, but you're a Cancerian, you're able to go with the flow, go with the tide. But if something is happening, you have to manifest it. And I think, Cancer, you are able to manifest it, because of the role of Saturn. The Sun making a trine to Saturn, Jupiter making a trine to Saturn, and it can all become part of your personal system, and in the process, you can become very lucky and probably more of an extrovert. Especially once the moon moves out of Libra and into Scorpio, and when the moon moves out of Scorpio, out of Libra, you feel sort of more whole, and maybe a period of introspection is coming to an end, and you can really start to think about what you can do, how you can make things happen. And this Grand Trine in water signs does to an extent focus on what makes you special, what makes you different. It's not about following the crowd. It's about you very quickly becoming aware of what makes you different, and being able to show perhaps a new side of yourself, but in a way that's just very easy. This is a Grand Trine in water signs. There's no pressure. You don't have to make any effort. In fact, it would be a bad idea to make an effort. Because if you make an effort, if you try too hard, then what you're doing is essentially you're using excessive force. And when you're using excessive force, things just start to escalate. And in fact, the natural energy, the natural momentum is enough. You really don't have to, try any harder. Leo. The Sun is making a trine to Jupiter, and the Sun is also making a trine to Saturn. So in other words, we've got a Grand Trine involving the Sun, Jupiter and Saturn. So this Grand Trine must surely have an impact on you. The Sun represents you. It's you, where you are, hopefully feeling good about yourself, and feeling relatively secure, and where your place is, and nonetheless you're in a position where you can make things happen. And it might not seem immediately obvious how you are making things happen. You are just minding your own business, and something you do, something you say causes something to happen. And it could be just sheer willpower, but it could just also be about just your emotions. And Leo is not known to be an especially emotional sign, but with this Grand Trine, you're just able to align yourself, with whatever's going on with the flow, and it's a very easy aspect. So it's very easy for you to make an impact, and it's also very easy to take something that you barely understand. You get a hint of it, and you can turn it into something which is out there, which is real, that you're in a position to actually manifest. And maybe, Leo, you're dealing with a power that you're not entirely comfortable with, and that might be something you do want to hide. And very often it's a good idea to hide your own power. You don't want other people to overestimate you, or it's better to be underestimated, really. Because, if you're underestimated, well, you could say that you're just being left alone, and you can do what you want in your own way. And so, with this Grand Trine, I think to a great extent it may just be working almost on an unconscious level. You have images, you have ideas, you have pictures, and you know that you can put them into action at a later stage, but maybe just right now there is nothing much that you want to do. But you can drift with purpose. And perhaps that's what it's all about. It's not just drifting in a vague kind of way. You know that there's something out there, something you can apply yourself to. And so that's something that is welcome. Now, as far as relationships are concerned, there is a trine between the Sun and Saturn. I mean, that is part of the Grand Trine. And, of course, the Sun is your ruler. And Saturn rules Aquarius, your opposite sign. So you could say that Sun trine Saturn represents a situation where relationships may be just very easy, very spontaneous, and you might have your doubts. Can you get on with someone? Are you going to give the right signals? Are you being misunderstood? But it's not a time to be analyzing things too much. Just go with it. And I think that you and someone else can just find a natural rapport with one another. And, in the process, you may need some structure. Where do you find structure? And perhaps a good way of finding structure is through the right person. Perhaps you need some direction. Perhaps you need to be told what to do by the right person. And so I do think that Sun trine Saturn can, certainly facilitate relationships, can facilitate, the right kind of relationship. Virgo. One aspect we have today is Mercury making a sextile to Pluto. And, Mercury's position is, somewhat tenuous. I mean, Mercury is retrograde, and it's in Sagittarius, as I've already discussed. So you could argue that Mercury is not in a great position, and it can be sometimes difficult to apply yourself to really, indicate, who you are, what you want, and you might think you're being ignored. I don't think that is necessarily the case. I mean, Mercury is making the sextile to Pluto, and Pluto is quite a powerful energy. It's an energy that can get results, but in a way that isn't immediately obvious. And so if you want to have an impact, I think the best way of doing this is through careful preparation. You don't have to make an impact just immediately, but you can prepare the ground. You can work on something, you can practice something, and build up your strength, and all the while you're feeling yourself getting stronger. And this is perhaps because Mercury is pretty close to Mars still, and it's still pretty close to the Sun. I mean, Mercury is actually on the Sun-Mars midpoint, and so if you put the Sun-Mars together, Sun and Mars are very sort of energetic, masculine energies. So you put Mercury on this, and this shows that almost from nowhere, you can find the power. It's there, and your power and your ability to make things happen is very fundamental, but it's hidden. And I think it quite possible, Virgo, that you might be underestimated. People will just assume you don't have an impact, that you don't have an influence. And it's good to be underestimated, because when you are ready to make an influence, there will be no resistance. It will all be very easy, very straightforward. You are able to sort of come out from hiding, and you can very much show what you can do. But there's no need to take things too far. When we're talking about Mercury on the Sun-Mars midpoint, well, if you put Sun-Mars together, you get an idea of maybe overdoing things. I mean, Sun-Mars can be about fire, can be about overdoing things. Be careful with fire, by the way, with Mercury on a Sun-Mars midpoint. Sun-Mars can be about fire, it can be electricity, it can be about things that go bang. You don't want to mess with household appliances, for example. I mean, that would be not necessarily very desirable, and you also don't want to mess with other people too much. I mean, Mars is making a sesquiquadrate to Jupiter. Yes, I mean tomorrow, Tuesday, that sesquiquadrate is exact, and with that Mars sesquiquadrate Jupiter, that may say something about another person. Another person is ready to go, is ready to show who they are, and you have a lot of power for sure, but I think a lot of other people do as well. And there may be a particular person who is trying to assert themselves, who is trying to make an impact, and maybe they're trying too hard. And it could be under those circumstances that you have to be a restraining influence. Libra. There is not necessarily a huge amount going on today. I mean, the moon is still in your sign, at least at the beginning of the day, but it's moving out of your sign. It's moving into Scorpio. Well, it will be in Scorpio this evening in Europe or Africa, this afternoon in the Americas. Okay, not until tomorrow if you're in Australia or New Zealand or most of Asia, but you can perhaps benefit from the moon while it's still in Libra, especially as it's making a square to Jupiter. And with the moon square Jupiter, certainly during the first part of the day in the Americas, much later if you're in somewhere else, you are able to make it clear who you are and what you want. And while Libra, you understand the importance of keeping everyone happy. There are limits to that. Sometimes it's necessary to make it clear, what you expect, and you can perhaps do this in a way that is quite gentle. I mean, you don't have to cause a fuss necessarily. You just make it clear, and perhaps it's a question of leading by example. I mean, the thing about leading by example is that it assumes that other people will notice. I mean, some people are just not going to notice. Doesn't matter how hard you try, doesn't matter how good your example is, they're just not going to notice, they're not going to be bothered. But I mean, the right people will notice, and this is especially the case, Libra, if you're working in terms of your career. You absolutely can have an impact. People will listen, and you can indeed be powerful. You can create a transformation, if that's what you feel is necessary. So you don't have to take the situation as it stands. If there's something wrong, something that you want to change, then Libra, I'm absolutely confident that you can do it. And change can work on many levels. And even though we don't have any traditional planets in Earth signs, I'm confident that you can work on the material plane. What does the material plane mean? Well, it can be it's the plane of matter, of money, of getting real results, and all of that. You can make it happen, and you're facilitated by the fact that we have a Grand Trine in water signs. So we've got the Sun in Scorpio, Saturn in Pisces, Jupiter in Cancer. So those three signs from a Libran perspective are quite work, career, finance orientated. And that means that if you want a result, if you want to do something concrete to improve your material position, then I think you can. And it should be, much easier than expected. And it means that, you just have to give things a gentle push. You tell the universe what you want, you move something a little bit, you say something, you write something, you just initiate. And once you've initiated, you could say that with this Grand Trine, you get a chain reaction. Or because it's a Grand Trine in water, maybe it's the creation of a tsunami. So I don't know how tsunamis work, really. I know you think about earthquakes, but it could be some change somewhere that you initiate. It leads to one thing, it leads to another thing, and then it leads to a tsunami. But it's a kind of tsunami that no one really gets hurt. It's just a metaphor, isn't it? It's just the idea of how much power you can have, and you just don't have to put too much effort into it. And this also applies to relationships. Certain other people think they have a lot of power. They think that they want to do things. It doesn't take much to get them going. And people who want to make things happen, who appear to have a lot of power, may seem to be dangerous. But it might be the case, Libra, that you can use another person's power for their own benefits. You are a good judge of human character, and you know what starts someone off. You know how to trigger them. You know how to manipulate them into doing something, into using their own energy. And so this is maybe what you can do. And so, overall, you can almost like harness the energy of the universe in order to make things happen, and to make things happen your way. So Libra, that's it. I think you might think at the beginning of the day that not a great deal is happening, but I do think that you can make things happen, and you really shouldn't underestimate yourself. Scorpio. There is a Grand Trine in water signs, which I have been talking about quite a lot in this video. And with good reason, I think. And I'll be talking more about the Grand Trines in water signs and just Grand Trines in general later in this video. But, what we have at the moment is we've got the Sun in Scorpio. And the Sun in Scorpio is trine Jupiter, it's trine Saturn. So that's a lot of energy. And it's exact now, this Grand Trine. It's been forming over the last few days. And it represents, a high energy situation. But when I say a high energy, it's also quite subtle. I know there's a bit of a contradiction there, because it's a Grand Trine in water signs and not in fire signs. So water signs, you can harness this energy. You can make it all happen. And the Sun, of course, is in your sign. And so with the Sun in your sign, you perhaps are aware of what is happening. And that links to the Jupiter-Saturn trine. So the Jupiter-Saturn trine, okay, it's not exact, but it's pretty exact. It's less than a quarter of a degree apart. So if we're talking about a grand trine involving Jupiter and Saturn, you're talking about the energy of the planet. We're talking about the world. We're talking about what motivates people, what motivates the crowd. What is going on an unconscious level, because things are happening on an unconscious level. And I'm talking about the collective unconscious. You can see how things are moving. You're a Scorpio. You understand all of this. And with this Grand Trine in water, this gives you a special power almost to know what's going to happen next. And so you could say we should use this ability wisely, and maybe you can save yourself a lot of trouble and save other people a lot of trouble. It's a good time for giving warnings, and also to alert people of opportunities. And, when we're talking about Jupiter and Saturn, we are talking about the business cycle, how the business cycle is going to develop. A lot of people are completely conflicted about the business cycle. You could argue, for example, that we are going into recession. You could argue that. Some countries are going into recession, that things look grim. You could also argue that things are looking great. Things are going to be better. If you're in America, you could say, well, Donald Trump, he's got midterms in a year's time. He's got to do something with the economy. Might be how Scorpios are thinking. I'm not telling you right here, which way it's going to go. But these are the kind of questions you might be asking yourself. And so, Scorpio, it's a good opportunity to try to make sense, for example, of the financial pages of a newspaper. You might not always understand them, but I think you do understand them. You do understand what's going on, and I think this Grand Trine in water signs is really helpful in this sense. So do make the most of it, but don't exaggerate, because one aspect we have got coming up is Mars making a sesquiquadrate to Jupiter. So Mars is your ruler, so making a sesquiquadrate Jupiter, you might exaggerate. You might take something too far. So what might that be? Well, you might reach some conclusions about the way things are going and feel that you have to act immediately. In a way that makes sense. If you know there's a problem, or if you know there's an opportunity, you've got to do something. You've got to do it quick. But maybe not so quick, not so quick that you are totally disruptive. So Scorpio, do get that balance right. Sagittarius, there is a possibility that you are trying too hard. And, at the moment we have got Mercury and Mars moving through Sagittarius, moving through your sign. And you're, I think, picking up on this, with these planets in your sign. That has perhaps, encouraged you to, do things, feeling that you've got to make an impact. And the question is it really so necessary? Are you absolutely sure that you always have to be heard, that you always have to be taken notice of? And if you do try too hard, well, it could become difficult, and you might create more than you expected, and perhaps created more than you actually want. And Mars, at 9 degrees Sagittarius, that can be difficult. So as far as Mars is concerned, I'm thinking that with Mars at that degree, 9, 10 Sagittarius. Let's see what's going on with that Mars. It is making a sesquiquadrate to Jupiter. That's the first point to make about that Mars. So when you've got a planet making a sesquiquadrate to Jupiter, that Jupiter can make that planet larger than life. And additionally, if we look at what's actually on that Mars, I think I'm right in saying that we have got Mars on a fixed star. Yeah, there we are. Mars is conjunct Antares, so it's pretty close to Antares. So when you think about Antares, you are potentially dealing with quite a difficult energy. If we look at Vivian Robson, I hope I don't spend too long looking up what Vivian Robson. This is Vivian Robson, the fixed stars and constellations in astrology. So why is this relevant to you, Mars being on Antares? It's not because Mars is your ruler. It's because Mars is in your sign. So if we see what Robson says about Mars on Antares, got to get the right place for this. Okay, sorry about that. I should have prepared this. Anyway, Antares. So Antares is a binary star, fiery red and emerald green. It was one of the 4 royal stars of Persia in 3000 BC, sometimes called Shiloh and core Scorpio, the heart of the scorpion, and its influence is of the nature of Mars and Jupiter, and it can be quite martial, it can be quite aggressive. And Vivian Robson says about Mars on Antares that it is detrimental habits powerfully affecting the life, quarrels with friends and relatives, fairly favourable for gains. So you get the idea. It's a situation where you've got Mars conjunct this rather troublesome fixed star Antares, but also making a sesquiquadrate Jupiter. And so this goes back to what I was saying. There is some danger that you try too hard. And so, if you want something to happen, if you want to do something, do you have to do it all at once? I don't think you necessarily have to. And maybe you need to get a broader perspective and increase the time frame. I mean, the sun is not in Sagittarius yet. I mean, the sun will move into Sagittarius in less than 5 days' time, and maybe when the sun in Sagittarius moves into Sagittarius, that will be the time when Sagittarius season starts. Also, don't forget Mercury's in Sagittarius, but it's going retrograde, and so Mercury going retrograde might sort of indicate that it's not quite the right time. So Sagittarius, it's good that you've got energy. You have got energy. I mean, I hope you've got energy, but you just don't want that energy to be used against you. And who would use that energy against you? Well, you could use it against you yourself. It could be you, because you push things too far. And I just think it would be really unnecessary to do that. And at the same time, it's probably a good idea to listen to what other people are saying. You don't have to follow their lead. You don't have to agree with them. But some people have a clear idea about how you should go about things. And if you give them a chance, it can be quite persuasive. Okay, just because someone is persuasive doesn't mean that you should listen to them, but it is possible to be persuasive and also to be right, if those arguments are clear. So, give people a chance. You don't have to be gullible. You don't have to believe everything you're told. But you never know. You never know. What you might hear. And finally, I mean, as far as your social life is concerned, I mean, I've just said that certain people should be listened to. I mean, that's a good idea. But looking at everything, looking at all the people with the moon about to move into Scorpio, some things might have to slow down. You can't be everywhere at once. You might like to be everywhere at once, but you can't be. You can't be talking to everyone at once. And some people may be useful. Some people are perhaps going to be useful in the near future, but perhaps other people have done their work. You've perhaps benefited from each other, and now it might be time to create some distance, because if you're surrounded by people, you're not going to be able to think straight. And so maybe Sagittarius, your social life at some level needs to be rationalized. Capricorn. The big event is this Grand Trine in water signs, and that's one of the themes of this video. And Grand Trine in water signs, as I will be talking about at the end of this video, is it's a relatively rare event. And, when you've got a Grand Trine in water signs, things can move, quite quickly. And this Grand Trine in water signs does affect you. I mean, in particular, it affects Saturn. I mean, Saturn is your ruler. The Sun is making a trine to Saturn, and Jupiter is also making a trine to Saturn. So, so Capricorn, Saturn has a reputation as a planet for being, quite inflexible, for being cautious, wanting to hold back, but it's now involved in a Grand Trine. And so I think Capricorn, as far as is possible, you should try to see how far things will go, on their own. Not to just stop the tide, to feel you can stop the tide. You can't stop the tide. And this is obvious. I mean, it is completely obvious, particularly as Saturn is in Pisces. But, just because the tide is rising, just because there are, a lot of emotions flying around, doesn't mean that you're out of control. I mean, you're not out of control at all, because, Saturn is making that trine to the Sun, trine to Jupiter. So you can be in a complicated situation, or at least a situation that appears complicated, and be able to really, take full control of it and use it. It's like when you're dealing with the power of nature. That's how we create power. That's how we create electricity. Whether it's thermal power, hydroelectric power, whatever, nuclear power. There's always a way to harness it. And Capricorn, right now, with this Grand Trine in water signs, it's very much something you can do, and you can take other people's power, take the power of people who are very close to you, and use it for your own purposes, but not in a way that is manipulative, but in a way that really helps everyone, and you can recognize what everyone can achieve, and start to really be able to make things happen. And so Capricorn, don't ask too many questions. You might be asking yourself, where is it all going? Maybe you don't know where it's all going, but just because you don't know where everything is going doesn't mean you should necessarily stop the train. The train is moving. It's got a destination. It's just that right now you don't know where the destination is, but it is progress, and progress should probably be welcomed right now. And so, Capricorn, I think it's important that you are as optimistic as possible, and you don't therefore feel that you have to ask too many questions. Asking questions for the sake of it, you may not get any decent answers, but just because you don't get any decent answers doesn't mean that you shouldn't proceed. Aquarius. Moon starts today in Libra, and the moon in Libra, perfectly acceptable place for the moon to be in. I mean, it is in the Via Combustor. So in the moon in the Via Combustor, even when it's out of Libra into Scorpio, it's still in the Via Combustor. So Aquarius, there could be times over the course of the day where things perhaps happen that you hadn't fully accounted for, and it might be the case, for example, that you have created a set of routines which you might even be quite proud of. You thought you'd sorted it all out, you'd worked it all out, you thought you knew how it was going to unfold, and then it just doesn't unfold as expected. And so you have to make some changes. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to start again, but just don't assume that just because you put a lot of work into something, it will just unfold in exactly the way you expect, because it might not. And as far as what the main thing going on today is concerned. Well, it's got to be the Grand Trine in water signs, and this Grand Trine does affect you for sure. I mean, because Saturn is involved. Sun is trine Saturn, Jupiter is trine Saturn, Sun is trine Jupiter, and there are a number of ways of looking at this Grand Trine. I mean, one way of looking at it is to see it in a fairly materialistic way. It's about you, Aquarius, being able to get things done with a relative amount of ease. It just happens. It's all very straightforward. And if you don't ask too many questions, and if you just get involved in things, perhaps in a fairly emotional way. When I say emotions, I don't mean that in a way that is complicated, but just taking things as they want to go, not trying to resist too much. And everything has its purpose, and sometimes you don't know what that purpose is, but if you can just enter into the swing of things, things will move, and you'll get the results you're looking for. And it might mean that you are able to boost your position, you boost your status, maybe even get more money. I mean, you shouldn't be thinking about these kind of things, but these are just fortunate byproducts of you being part of some wider trend, and you being able to make the most of this trend that you are part of. So I think that this Grand Trine in water signs is useful, and I think when the moon moves into Scorpio, now the moon does move into Scorpio in the Americas this afternoon, this evening in Europe and Africa. So when the moon does move into Scorpio, that's going to improve the situation even more, because this Grand Trine in water isn't quite finished, because we've got a new moon coming up, and this new moon, when is it? It's on the 20th, so 2 days time or 3 days time, we've got the moon in. Today's the 17th, so the new moon is on the 20th. So this new moon will be at 28 Scorpio. So moon at 28 Scorpio will be trine Jupiter, will be trine Saturn. We've got a new moon coming up in Scorpio, in quite an important sign in your chart, and this new moon may represent a new beginning, a new opportunity for you to really get things off the ground. And this Grand Trine, we can see it in a different way. We could say, well, Sun is trine Saturn, and so Sun rules Leo. Leo is your opposite sign, and so with Sun trine Saturn, we might then say that has implications for relationships. Ruler of Aquarius trine ruler of Leo, and so with Sun trine Saturn, that indicates that relationships may be of considerable focus over the course of the day, and I think that is mainly in a fortunate way. Perhaps recently there has been some miscommunications. I mean, we got Mercury retrograde. You haven't always got on with someone, but with Sun trine Saturn, there is an opportunity to find a way of getting on with them. So if there have been recent problems in any kind of relationship, then I think that you have a chance to deal with it. And additionally, with a Sun trine Saturn, it might be talking about cooperation, really constructive cooperation. With another person, there's a particular task, and it might be very practical. You've got something to offer, they've got something to offer, you come together, and it all comes together, and everyone benefits. And so don't feel, Aquarius, that you have to do things on your own. Pisces, the big event of the day is a Grand Trine in water signs involving the Sun, Jupiter, and Saturn. Jupiter's your ruler. Jupiter rules Pisces. And so with this Grand Trine, that does really indicate that things really are happening, that things are moving, because you got Saturn in Pisces. And as I, like to say, with Saturn in Pisces, it's almost like Saturn is your ruler. I mean, I know Saturn is not your ruler, but you have a good relationship with Saturn at the moment. Saturn's your friend. And so with Saturn trine Jupiter, well, Saturn is especially your friend. When Saturn is trining Jupiter, your ruler, you have the discipline to make sure that things work your way. And it's not discipline in a way that is constraining. You don't have to do anything. There's no obligation. It's just, taking what you have and making the absolute most of it. And then the sun is involved as well. So, the sun, you could say, in general, is a positive, creative, dynamic force. It's trine Saturn, trine Jupiter. And so you do feel not just that you're doing things right, but you're doing things as expected. Many of us do feel that there is an expectation, and this expectation doesn't come from our family or our employer or our memories of our parents. It comes from something else. It comes maybe from a sense of purpose, and that purpose is quite spiritual. Especially if we think that we have been put here to do something, and this concept of purpose and what we're supposed to do, it changes. I don't know how often it changes, depends. It's because it's not necessarily just about one life purpose. We were born to do one thing and we do it, and that's it. We may be born to do one thing at a particular time, and when that time is over, well, we've either done it or we haven't. And so that is perhaps the perspective one should have. Right now, there's something that you're definitely able to do, and it's not just about benefiting yourself. It's about making the world a better place or putting something right, and that is definitely something that is really possible. And so whatever you're doing, whatever you're planning, do try to take quite a spiritual approach. When I say spiritual, I'm not asking you to drift off into nowhere. Spirituality can be very down to earth. You make a change and it's real, and that something wanted you to do it. So that might be a way in which this Grand Trine could work. But when we're talking about Grand Trines, we also need to say that Grand Trines can get out of control. Even though Saturn is involved in this Grand Trine, there's always that possibility with a Grand Trine. And you need some kind of discipline and maybe a bit of social frugality. You can't be friends with everyone. You can't be all things to all people. You can't be everywhere at once. And perhaps, Pisces, you need to ask yourself, what is important? What matters? And also recognize that you have your limits. And sometimes you feel you've got no limits, especially now, Mars is sesquiquadrate Jupiter. With Mars sesquiquadrate Jupiter, Jupiter's your ruler. You may be encouraged to take something too far, to push something further than it needs to be pushed. And with a Grand Trine, that can be a problem, taking something too far. And so that's why you need a certain amount of frugality, and realizing what you can do and realizing what your limits are. And that might be an important key to being successful today. And those are my forecasts for the 12 signs. And now it is time to look at things from the viewpoint of the I Ching. So I asked the question, what is Monday going to be like for those watching the I Ching section of this video? And the first hexagram I got was hexagram number 19, approach. This hexagram is quite sociable, as its name implies. We are getting closer to people. We are starting to exert some kind of influence. At least that's what we are trying to do. And so it should be a fairly fortunate process, though, we can't necessarily expect things to always be fortunate. There is a warning that, in the end, things might go wrong, things might not go to plan. So that's certainly a possibility. And, with this hexagram, we do have the bottom line moving. And so with the bottom line moving, when you've got this, in I Ching, the bottom line is often, the very beginning of an action. And it can be an action that has only just started. And it might be an action where we're not necessarily in a particularly strong position. And we just might need to be aware of that. We are perhaps introducing ourselves to something new. We're aware of our own power, but ideally we should also be aware of our limitations. And, looking at the translation by James Legge, he says, with that bottom line, there can be strength, but not necessarily prudence. So yeah, you can be strong, but maybe there's a wisdom deficit. And the question is, what are we doing with this strength? Are we doing anything useful with it? And so we need to show a lot of discipline. And I think that this is actually reflecting the fact that we've got a Grand Trine in water signs. We've got Sun, Trine Jupiter, Trine Saturn, and Sun, Trine Jupiter. There's a lot of enthusiasm with Sun, Trine Jupiter. Sun in Scorpio, Trine Jupiter in Cancer. But Saturn is asking us to hold on, pause. Don't just be too enthusiastic about the situation. You have to go through the steps. And if you take things too quickly, then you could fall flat on your face. And that is especially the case if we're trying to make an impact, enhance our social role. And then the fifth line moves. And the fifth line moves. And the fifth line moves. That's actually quite a good line. And this line indicates that we do become credible, and people start to notice us, and we're aware that we have a real influence, and we can show leadership, having gone through the process. With that bottom line moving, one thing you could say about that bottom line is, for example, you can only have an influence by what you do, by being observed. If you try to take things further, if you try to be really aggressive, try to assert yourself, well, that's not going to work. You just have to show the world what you can do in a relatively passive way. But then we move on to this fifth line, and I think that we are being noticed, and we are developing a certain wisdom that perhaps we didn't have at the beginning of the day. Of course, this is just a hexagram for the beginning, it's just a hexagram for one day. So the question is, how can wisdom develop over the course of a day? I don't know, maybe it can. We often learn from our mistakes, and when you make a mistake, you become a little bit wiser. You perhaps see how something wasn't working, or you see how you were being a bit hasty, and then you moderate your approach, and then finally you find the right approach, and in the process, you have developed. So things start to look good. We start to make an impact. We start to have an influence, and then we do move to a new situation, and we move to a second hexagram, and the hexagram we move to is hexagram number 19, which is the abysmal. Sounds pretty abysmal, doesn't it? But it's not. The abysmal is a very watery hexagram. The abyss, again, that's appropriate for having a Grand Trine in water signs, and it is about understanding the danger. And when I was talking about the previous hexagram approach, there was certainly a danger of being too enthusiastic, thinking we really could just make things happen, we could sort of go storming in, create waves, but no, we did have to be more subtle than that. And clearly with the abysmal, we've got to be really careful because, we might fall into the pit. That's always a problem with the abysmal. But what's also said about the abysmal is that we're dealing with a danger we understand. So because we're dealing with a danger where we understand, we should be okay. And we just have to just follow gravity. That's what one of the translations says. I think is it the Wilhelm translation? We just follow gravity. Water has its natural path. We go down that path. And we therefore, we don't do anything unnatural. We understand the demands of the time, and it's okay. And when dealing with the abysmal, we have to remember the previous hexagram, and the previous hexagram approach. There is that warning that things might not work out in the end. Where they might work out to a certain point, but there could, in fact, be in the end misfortune. I think that with 19, the approach, it talks about misfortune in the 8th month. By the 8th month, that relates to the Chinese calendar. And if you're talking about a Chinese calendar, I think that is Northern Hemisphere. That's sort of late summer. You can sort of look it up. If you take, I don't know, I think it's like lunar months. I'm not really into Chinese astrology and the Chinese calendar. I know about the I Ching. That's a sort of major failing on my part. Maybe I sound like a fraud. I think I have a reasonably good rapport with the I Ching, but we're not necessarily talking about the late summer. We're just talking about the idea that we show some leadership. We do exert our influence, but we know that it's a temporary situation. In the end, things might go wrong. Things might not turn out as expected. And, this takes us back to the abysmal, how things are going wrong, what might happen in the end. Yeah, we're in a situation where we have to tread carefully, but we're dealing with a situation that we understand. We have seen it before. So that's it. That's all I want to say about the I Ching. And now I want to talk about the Grand Trine in water signs. And following that, I just want to quickly talk about Epstein again. But let's start with the Grand Trine in water signs. So let's just clarify one more time what exactly I mean, what I'm talking about. So if we look at the chart for today, let's just set that back to putting Aries on the left. So we have Saturn in Pisces, Jupiter in Cancer, the Sun in Scorpio. And this particular configuration is relatively unusual, relatively rare, because we've got Jupiter trine Saturn. That will happen. In a Jupiter Saturn cycle that lasts 20 years, you're going to have the waxing trine between Jupiter and Saturn as the conjunction moves towards the opposition, and then you've got the waning trine. So you're going to have these two trines between Jupiter and Saturn, but they're going to have a different nature probably. The waxing trine, which we have here, because we had the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction at the end of 2020 at 0 degrees Aquarius. So this is the waxing trine when we've reached perhaps a particular stage in the cycle, whether it's a social cycle, a business cycle, economic cycle. We've reached a stage. A Jupiter and Saturn will not make that exact trine this time around. That won't happen until next year, and 2026. And that trine will be between Jupiter in Leo and Saturn in Aries. But it's not all the time, it's not every time that the Sun is also in a position where it is making a grand trine. So that's why it's a somewhat sort of unusual aspect. It's not common. I mean, even the Jupiter trine Saturn is not common, but it just may be a period of perhaps a few days where it kind of strongly sort of manifests, where suddenly things run very quickly, very easily, perhaps too quickly. And this could relate to the way people behave, the way groups behave. And it might also be about an awareness of the economy. Now, all things being equal, I would have probably said that the waxing Jupiter-Saturn trine, like we got now, is going to be more fortunate than the waning Jupiter-Saturn trine. This is as Jupiter and Saturn are moving away from the conjunction in 2000. I mean, I know it seems a long time ago now, but it wasn't so long. Time flies. And so things are moving, and the sun, what the sun is doing, it is reminding us of the power of Jupiter and Saturn. It might be particular events which are telling us about the business cycle. They're telling us about what's going on in society, what's going on in our country, wherever we're living. Each country has sort of different conditions, and so that's one aspect. But it could just be about emotion. It is an emotional trine because it's in water signs, and with Saturn you think of something trying to control. That Sun Jupiter, the enthusiasm of Sun trine Jupiter, and Saturn is trying to say, well, don't take things too far. You need to limit things to some extent, and so maybe this Grand Trine is not working. This sort of Grand Trine is not necessarily working as it does normally. You think of Grand Trine as just flow, no limits, but Saturn is involved. There's got to be some limits with Saturn involved in this Grand Trine. And I was thinking about previous Grand Trines in water signs. No, not in water sign, in any sign. Why restrict ourselves to one element? And I just wanted to give you an example of a Grand Trine, and I'll look at the Grand Trine on November the 6th, 1974. Now, that was over 50 years ago. So if you look at this, now you might look at this chart and you say, well, hold on, this is not a Grand Trine because Jupiter and Saturn are a long way apart. So Jupiter and Saturn were 11 degrees apart. So you could say, well, that is not a Grand Trine because it's too far. Well, I understand that argument, but the midpoint of Jupiter and Saturn here was about 13 Taurus, Scorpio. So there was a Sun-Venus conjunction on that day, and it was on the Saturn-Venus midpoint. So the Sun was trine Saturn, Sun was trine Jupiter, and Venus as well. So I think there was a Grand Trine in water signs, particularly if you use midpoints. And so the question is, what happened on November the 6th, 1974? I'm not saying anything huge happened, but there were some events that might give us some insights into what the Grand Trine is all about. So let me just tell you these events that took place on November the 6th, 1974. So firstly, there was a train crash. It's reading from Wikipedia. At least 80 people died in a collision between two passenger trains 40 miles west of Cotonou in Dahomey. So you could say with a Grand Trine, things were moving. Sun trines Jupiter, and then Saturn. There was a clash. Then you had some space stuff. The Soviet Union's lunar probe, Luna 23, landed on the moon in the Mare Crisium for the purpose of gathering and returning lunar soil to the Earth. The probe's drill was damaged when Luna 23 tipped over after landing on unfavorable terrain. I'm not sure about that, how relevant that is to this Grand Trine. Then Argentina. Argentina's President Isabel Perón unexpectedly issued an emergency decree of a state of siege in the South American nation in an effort to deal with political violence. but had claimed 136 lives during her first 129 days in office. The decree banned all public meetings and allowed any suspected terrorists to be arrested without a court order and held indefinitely without being brought to trial. Now, got a bit of a law and order feel here. Sun trine Jupiter. Things are getting out of control. We think about Jupiter as being a fortunate aspect, but not necessarily. Things are out of control. And Saturn, the power of the state, is trying to get involved here. And this is, there's a Sun-Venus conjunction. So we have Isabel Perón, we have female president really trying to stamp her authority on things here. And then in Northern Ireland, 33 inmates of the Long Kesh prison, later called the Maze in Northern Ireland, most of them convicted terrorists of the IRA, attempted to escape through an underground tunnel which they had dug. IRA member Hugh Coney was shot and killed by a guard after emerging outside the walls, and 29 others were captured only a few yards past the prison. The other 3 were captured within 24 hours. So there is the escape, Sun trine Jupiter. We want to leave the prison. We want to get out of this prison. And then again, Saturn interferes. Now, Jupiter-Saturn can also relate to the business cycle. They are the great chronocrators. And the final manifestation of this Grand Trine is, there was an election in Singapore, but I don't think that's necessarily the issue. But anyway, the U.S. Treasurer on November 6, 1974, U.S. Treasury Secretary William E. Simon conceded in a press conference that the United States economy was in a recession as stock prices continued to fall. And this tells us that the Jupiter-Saturn cycle is very much connected with business and the stock market. And, this Jupiter-Saturn trine, it was a waning Jupiter-Saturn trine. It came after the Jupiter-Saturn opposition, the end of the 1960s. And so, the economy was not great. We're not talking about growth here. And so the concept of recession might be more of an issue here with this Jupiter-Saturn trine than in the waxing Jupiter-Saturn trine, which it's waxing Jupiter-Saturn trine hit by the sun at the moment. I mean, people are still talking about recession. I mean, there are countries which apparently are in recession in Europe, but it's kind of already known. But, the market, if you look at the markets at the moment of Jupiter trine Saturn, they are very unstable. I mean, you particularly had large falls of cryptocurrency. I think, Bitcoin has fallen by something like 30% in the last month. It is not what people expected. People are very worried about that if they own Bitcoin. But I know that the stock market indices are still very close to their highs, but they have had some substantial falls, and there are worries. And so I think that these are ideas about how the Sun and Jupiter and Saturn, might manifest. And turning to just one example, a pretty sort of unpleasant example. When you're dealing with trines, things can get out of control, and you can have cycles of violence. And there was a Sun, Jupiter, Saturn, Grand Trine, sort of, in 1948, and if you can see this if you look at the horoscope of Israel. So this is the birth of Israel, and I mean, not that it has a Grand Trine in water signs. It doesn't have a Grand Trine in water signs. It has a Grand Trine. It doesn't have a Grand Trine, but there is Saturn and Jupiter. So in fact, Jupiter is just separating from a trine to Saturn. Now, earlier in the year, there was some sort of Grand Trine energy, and one event that happened was on April the 9th, 1948. I think I've gone to around for 1948. So in the run-up to Israeli independence or the declaration of the Israeli state, there were massacres. You had groups like, Haganah massacring Palestinians, and you also had Arabs massacring Jews. I mean, it happened on both sides. And this is the Deir Yassin massacre, where I think members of Haganah went into an Arab village and just massacred people sort of indiscriminately. And so here you have, and it just happened just before a new moon, and so you sort of had a Grand Trine, but of course this is a Grand Trine in fire signs. So I mean, I know again it doesn't seem exact because the Sun, but Saturn, Jupiter, and Saturn are so far out. They're 13 degrees off the trine, but the Sun is relatively close. I mean, the Sun is 6 degrees from a trine to 4 degrees from a trine to Saturn, and 9 degrees from a trine to, is that right, from Jupiter. So it's sort of there. And so when you've got a Grand Trine, in this case in fire, things can just get out of control, completely out of control. There's no stopping a Grand Trine. So you can imagine at a Grand Trine when people start killing each other, people just when do you stop? And of course, when you've got one massacre, it leads to another massacre. I'm not sure if these massacres are connected, whether it's retaliation or it just happened. But a few days later, on April the 13th, you had the Hadassah massacre, where it was a medical convoy of Jewish doctors and medical personnel, which was, in this case, it was the Arabs that ambushed it, and there was a massacre. And likewise, we've still got our Grand Trine. There's our Grand Trine. The Sun was five degrees off Jupiter. Jupiter was still 13 degrees apart, but the Sun was kind of halfway. Was halfway between Jupiter and making a trine to Jupiter, trine to Saturn. So I think there is a Grand Trine feel to that. So I mean, I just use this example from Israel, or the months just before Israeli independence, before it declared itself as an independent state, just to show how Grand Trines can work. So when we're thinking about this Grand Trine, now this is the Grand Trine we've got, Sun, Jupiter, Saturn. Okay, it's not in fire signs, but it's still this idea about things can happen quickly, things can happen easily, perhaps too easily. Yeah, you could have a cycle of violence. I mean, that's one way of looking at it, but it's also Jupiter, Saturn, and it says something about the economy and people's thoughts about the economy, and whether or not we're going into a recession and so on. I mean, I think because this Jupiter, Saturn is waxing. It is usually a time when Jupiter and Saturn is in this kind of position that it doesn't indicate that the markets are going to completely collapse. I mean, I know people are very worried about the markets, but I'm just not entirely convinced. Especially as we've got midterms in a year's time. I think that the Trump regime is going to do everything it can to pump the American economy, and with this sort of Grand Trine energy, I think they'll probably get away with it in the short term. Now, what happens after 2026? Well, that is another matter, and I do have some thoughts about that, but I'll have to discuss that in another video. So those are a few thoughts on the Grand Trine. And now I just want to finish by having another look at Jeffrey Epstein. Another reason I'm having another look at Jeffrey Epstein is because I just didn't mention his time. I was using a noon chart, and then I just realized, it was pointed out to me, but at a time is available. And so I went to astro.com, looked him up, and it says it's 6:15. And I think part of it is because you had that Epstein birthday book where it had his birth certificate in it. And there's some question about whether it was 6:15 a.m. or 6:15 p.m. But I'll just take astro.com's word for it here. They do give it a AA rating. So this is Jeffrey Epstein's chart, apparently, if he's born at 6:15 a.m. So he has Capricorn rising. And he's got his moon at 714 Aries. And so with Capricorn rising, that gives us an idea now. Capricorn rising, would you have expected Capricorn rising? What does one think about Capricorn rising? He's certainly showed a certain un-Capricorn behavior, you could say. Depends how you want to see Capricorn. I mean, you might want to see Capricorn in terms of its sexuality, and you can go down that road with Capricorn. But maybe what's more relevant is perhaps what is rising, and the fact that you have got he's got a Chiron Uranus opposition there, which was on his ascendant, and Chiron opposition Uranus, can be a generation that really wants to stand out, wants to be different, and because it's on his ascendant, that's what he's trying to do. I mean, that doesn't explain his the particularities of his behavior. I think you have to look, for example, at his Venus Mars conjunction. And what I found interesting about this chart was his moon. I mean, he has his moon at 7 degrees Aries. Now, what is his moon doing? The moon is, on the face of it, not doing a great deal. I mean, as far as the aspects the moon is making, it's making a trine to true black moon Lilith, but that's not particularly dramatic. But it is making a sesquiquadrate to Pluto. And so moon sesquiquadrate Pluto, can be somewhat difficult, can represent perhaps powerful emotions, maybe emotions that are kept hidden. And of course he has the moon in Aries. Now, you would have thought that as he would get older, as he moved out of childhood, that his sun in Aquarius would take over, but maybe that moon in Aries is still pretty operational. When you think about moon in Aries, you think about someone just doing whatever they like. I don't care, do what I like. That's what that could be how moon in Aries works. And there's your sesquiquadrate to Pluto, being maybe sort of quite obsessed about power. And what I wanted to look at was the midpoints involving the moon. And so if we set up the 90-degree dial for Jeffrey Epstein, because we did need his time of birth for this, because the moon does move 12, 13, 14, even 15 degrees in a day, so we do need a time of birth if we want to look at the midpoint tree of the moon. So there's his moon. So let's put the dial onto his moon and just look at what midpoints his moon is on. And his moon is, there is the sesquiquadrate to Pluto. So moon, when you've got a sesquiquadrate on a 90-degree dial, it's shown as an opposition. But the moon is on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. It is also on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. It's also on the Venus-Saturn midpoint. So Jeffrey Epstein has a Venus-Mars conjunction in his horoscope, a very close Venus-Mars conjunction. And so the moon, if you look at that axis, has the Venus-Mars conjunction on one side, Saturn on the other. And so, when you think about Saturn, in terms of sexuality, you think, Venus, Mars, moon on the Venus-Saturn midpoint, that must be, very sort of restrained and sort of repressing one's sexuality, for example. And no, that's not necessarily how it works. Saturn can be, quite crude, and it can be promiscuous. Venus-Saturn can be a promiscuous aspect. And Donald Trump, he has a Venus-Saturn conjunction, as we discussed. But having Moon on the Venus-Saturn midpoint and Venus on the Mars-Saturn, Moon on the Venus-Saturn midpoint, Venus on the Mars-Saturn, that may say something about his behavior. And it may also say about something about his perception of women in general. Moon is a female planet. And how he treats women, Moon on the Mars-Saturn midpoint, Venus on the Venus-Saturn midpoint, that could be, for example, about objectifying women, just seeing them as objects. And it's not just that, he's also got the Moon on the Mars-Hades midpoint. And, this is what he's doing. This is what he's perhaps able to get away with. So, or thinks he can get away with. So I thought his moon midpoint tree was very interesting. And I wanted to just finish looking at Jeffrey Epstein by considering the date of his death. And, we don't know for sure when he died. And so here is a possible Epstein. So he died on August the 10th, 2019. And of course, there are all sorts of ideas about whether he committed suicide, whether he was murdered. I'm not going to go into that. But this is a chart. I mean, he was found dead in his cell at 6:30 in the morning on August the 10th. So he would have died, one estimate he died perhaps a couple of hours earlier. So I've set this for 4:30 a.m. Maybe this isn't the right time. So who knows? But it's good enough, I think. So this raises the question. What transits did he have at the time of his death? So here are the transits. Look at Saturn. Saturn, when he died, was at 1504 Capricorn. So Saturn was on his Chiron, and it was opposition his Uranus. So I think that Saturn, that Chiron Uranus opposition was important. I mean, I know it's quite a collective aspect, but because it's close to his ascendant. I mean, who knows? Maybe he was born a bit later. Maybe his ascendant, Capricorn is quite a fast-moving ascendant, by the way, in the northern hemisphere. So maybe he had his ascendant. There was a slightly later time speculated, I think, of 625. So maybe he has got 15 degrees Capricorn rising. I mean, so Saturn certainly played a role, I think, in his death. I mean, I feel fairly confident about that, because Saturn was on his Chiron and on his opposition his Uranus, and Chiron additionally was transiting Chiron. Was on his moon, but. Look at Mars. Transiting Mars was at 25 Leo. And that means that if we've got his time right, his 8th house cusp is at 2408 Leo, and he's got Pluto on the 8th house cusp. So if he's got Pluto on Mars on the 8th house cusp, it's a signature of death. I wouldn't have said it was necessarily a signature of hanging, but I'm reminded of the horoscope of Adolf Eichmann. Adolf Eichmann was obviously the Nazi war criminal who was kidnapped by Israeli intelligence, by Mossad in Argentina, and he was taken in 1960, and he was taken back to Israel. He was put on trial, sentenced to death, and he was hanged. And if you look at Adolf Eichmann's chart, this is a chart of his execution. But if you look at Adolf Eichmann's execution, and because he was hanged, Adolf Eichmann was hanged with Mars on his 8th house cusp. Of course, this was Taurus, so Taurus is the neck, so you can very much associate that. But assuming we've got Epstein's time right, then both Epstein and Eichmann met their deaths by hanging or strangulation or whatever. I mean, certainly in Epstein's case with Mars on their eighth house cusps. So that that's a thought about the transits for Epstein. Then there is his solar return. So looking at the solar return just before he died, because you do need a time of birth to really make full use of the solar return. So here is the solar return, and set for New York. Well, he was born in New York, he died in New York, and so you've got Pluto rising, and you've got Moon-Pluto opposition. And remember, in Epstein's chart, he had a Moon sesquiquadrate Pluto, and so we see another Moon-Pluto aspect, at the time of his death. So having Moon opposition Pluto, Moon opposition Mercury, that certainly indicates that something is going on here for him. That it is not an easy time, and Saturn was pretty close to his ascendant at the time of the solar return, and of course he hanged himself 8 months or so later, is that right, or 7 months later? So I think it is certainly a difficult solar return. And then there is his solar arc directions, and of course he was 66. Of course he was 66. I mean, one other thing about him, he was just to say that Jeffrey Epstein. So he died when he was 66. So if he died when he was 66, in terms of his perfected ascendant, when you hit 60, because it's multiple, but you divide it by 12, that's your ascendant. So when you hit 66, it's the opposite sign of Cancer. So he's got Uranus in his descendant. So his perfected ascendant is Cancer. His year ruler is therefore the Moon. He's got Uranus on the descendant. So the power of that Uranus on the descendant suddenly became very strong when he hit his 66th birthday on January the 20th, 2019, and the power of that Moon as well. And I've talked about the fact that he's got Moon on the Mars-Saturn midpoint, and that's a classic death configuration. So maybe when his Moon became his annual ruler, you could see that, even though you could say Moon in Aries, the Moon joys in I was going to say the third house, but he's got his Moon in the third house from a Placidus perspective. But if you're talking about whole sign planets, whole sign houses, and that would be in the fourth. So yeah, from a Placidus perspective, you could say the Moon joys in the third, but then if you want to use whole signs, then that's in the fourth. And yeah, it is interesting that he's got Moon sesquiquadrate Pluto. So the difficulties of the Moon really seem to manifest, once he hit his 66th birthday. And finally, there's his solar arc directions. So he's born 66. So if we move his planets, approximately 66 degrees, 66.5 degrees. I mean, not exactly, because you're using a solar arc, which is slightly different. But as far as what were his solar arc aspects, when he died, and the Sun was at 7 degrees 2 minutes Aries. So that's interesting that the Sun is at 7 degrees 2 Aries. So when the Sun hit his Moon by solar arc direction, that's when he died. And likewise, when the midheaven hit his ascendant, so when his midheaven moved approximately 61 degrees, that's when he died. So I think that what I find interesting here is I do find that Sun interesting. I look at his Mars. A solar arc Mars was at there's his solar arc Mars at 22 degrees Taurus was solar arc Mars hitting his Pluto. But as far as the Sun is concerned, so what you can do is you can ask, well, what exact midpoints was the Sun on, when he died? So if you look at Epstein's horoscope, remembering a solar arc Sun is at 7 degrees 2. So let's just look at his midpoints. I'll make these as large as possible. So this is the midpoint printout from from Kepler. And so what the Kepler does, it gives you the midpoint trees, and I'll try and make this as big as possible. And then it gives a midpoint sort. So I'm looking at the 45 degree sort. So his Sun was at, what did I say, 7 degrees 4. His progressed Sun was at 7 degrees 4 Aries. So it was on his moon, but it had just passed his Saturn, say 6 months earlier, and it was now sort of moving to, so it was hitting his moon Pluto conjunction, and he had his, there is the Mars Saturn midpoint. So although the Sun had crossed his Mars Saturn midpoint, probably technically seven months earlier, I would argue that the moon was sort of picking up on that Mars Saturn midpoint. The moon had some of the qualities, and Pluto had some of the qualities of that Mars Saturn midpoint, and perhaps that explains why when the Sun, solar arc directed Sun, was hitting that moon, that's why he was in danger. That's why you've got to look at the midpoint. Just looking at the moon on its own perhaps would not have told you much, but you had to look at what aspects the moon was making. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say on the subject of Jeffrey Epstein. So thank you very much for watching this video. If you enjoyed this video, I'd be very grateful if you were to like it. If you're not subscribed, I'd be super grateful if you were to subscribe. If you want to buy me a coffee, there's a link in the description, and I will talk to you again tomorrow.